Life Rhythms with Ryan Skyy. Observing the world around me, looking inward, trying to make sense of it all. Welcome to Life Rhythms Radio Show. I'm your host, DJ producer Ryan Skyy. Life Rhythms is a radio show that revolves around my personal growth journey. As a songwriter and music producer, I spend a lot of my time observing the world around me, looking inward, trying to make sense of it all. I've been doing it in song form, and now I'm doing it in my radio show. The way the show works is each episode we feature one song and one topic. The topic of today's episode, we're going to be talking about the stories of the mind, the power that they have on us, good and bad. And I've got a very special guest on today. His name is Gareth Emery. I'm a huge fan of Gareth's. He's got his fourth studio album is out right now called The Lasers. And we are featuring his song, You'll Be Okay, off of that album. Gareth wrote this song. We're going to talk about the inspiration behind it later, but it's a very personal song. He wrote a lot of the lyrics on the album, which is a departure. As a DJ producer, it's more of a collaborative effort. And what I love about having him on the show today is because Gareth talks about the stories that he was telling himself that was limiting him from writing lyrics, from taking on projects and living the kind of life that he wanted to live and being the kind of person he wanted to be. He had not considered himself a lyricist up until this point because he had stories in his mind that he was not a lyricist. And he had to kind of challenge those stories. And it was a great experience for him to write on the album and kind of prove to himself that he is a great lyricist. And when you listen to the album, The Lasers, you can hear that right away. The songs, they're emotional, they're melodic, they're heartfelt. He very clearly has a talent for lyrics. It's just he had to let go of the story he was telling himself that he could not write lyrics. That's what we're going to be talking about today. It's very interesting to me. A lot of times we don't realize how much storytelling plays a role in our lives, how many stories we tell ourselves throughout the day about who we are, where we've come from, what's happening to us. That's what we're going to be talking about today with Gareth, because we can use them to our advantage. We can use stories to reframe our past, reframe the way we look at ourselves, to kind of like envision a new future for us and become the best versions of ourselves, which is the goal at Life Rhythms. We're all about becoming the best humans we can. So we're going to take a short break, and when we get right back, we're going to dive into this interview with Gareth. I've got my manager and co-host, Scott Waldman, is going to be joining us. We're going to be talking about his album and really getting personal about the stories right when we get back from this short break. Welcome to Life Rhythms Radio Show. I'm your host, DJ producer Ryan Skyy. I have with me a very special guest today, Gareth Emery. Hey, Gareth.
How you doing? Good to be here.
Excited to have you on the show today. I also have my co-host and manager, Scott Waldman. Hey, Scott.
And I know you'll be okay.
That's from the new single, You'll Be Okay, off of Gareth's fourth studio album, The Lasers. And we heard a little clip of this song coming into the segment, You'll Be Okay. First of all, I love the song, Gareth.
Thank you.
And what's really cool to me about this album, so this is your fourth studio album, but it's the first album that you approached it kind of like a band would approach putting something out. You worked with one vocalist for the whole album, and you wrote and produced every song on the album. That's what that's...
Yeah, that's accurate. And you know,
that's what I was, reading the album. Yeah,
that's right. And the other albums I've done were more classic dance music albums where I was the producer, but I didn't write the songs. I'd have somebody say, "Hey, I've got," which is not everybody knows. That's the way in electronic music things are normally done, right? The DJs don't tend to write the songs. Somebody goes, "Hey, I've got a song for you," and you go, "Right," and you make a instrumental around that song. And for me, I started missing my days of playing in bands when I actually did this stuff, and I was like, "Man, I want to make an album like being in a band." So I had to get past some old, I'd told myself for a long time I couldn't write my own songs, and I had to push through a few sort of mental blocks, but yeah, we got there and we did it.
I love that you led with that, because I would love to talk today about the power of stories in the mind. And I would say to the listeners, you may not realize how many stories we tell ourselves throughout the day. Well, actually, I wrote a quote on the topic. I always write a quote for each episode. So I'll read the quote and then we can go from there. Stories. They have the power to free us. They can strengthen our identity for better or for worse. Stories can help us cope. They can help us heal, reframe the past, and empower our future. But stories also have the potential to limit us. They can cause undue stress and worry. Our mind uses stories to keep a historical record, but the human mind is notoriously unreliable when it comes to facts and perceptions. And so while stories are powerful and can transform our human experience for the better, they can also be our worst enemy. Pay close attention to the stories that you tell yourself about who you are, what has happened to you in the past, what's happening to you right now, what might happen to you in the future, because it's all up for debate and interpretation. The human mind skews negative, and stories can compound our suffering. But with the right awareness, we can use stories to change our inner narrative and lead a peaceful life that's both fulfilling and a source of happiness. I'd love to talk about that today, the power stories. I love that you led with your relationship to writing lyrics and kind of how you had this story for a while that you were not a lyricist or a writer, and you kind of reframe that story in order to take on this project. And then I would love to hear, so what was your experience when you sat down and actually started writing these songs?
Well, I was fortunate because it sort of happened by accident. I'd tell myself my entire life I didn't write lyrics. I'd never written lyrics in my entire life. And even back when I wrote all the songs for a band I used to be in, somebody else wrote the lyrics. We had a great poet in the band and that was his job. And in dance music, nobody really challenged that, and nobody ever told me, hey, like, you should write lyrics. And I never said to myself, hey, I should write lyrics. So it became this 20-year story. And if some pretty crazy events hadn't happened in my life, it would have been a lifelong story. And essentially, to cut a long story short, I parted ways with my long-term manager, who was a person who was excellent at finding me a lot of great songs. And when me and her parted ways, I was like, shit, like, where do I get great songs from now? Because she was always the person that said, hey, I found this great song. I found this great top line for you. It's how some of my bigger songs came about. And realizing I didn't have her excellent A&R ear sort of in my corner, I pretty soon realized unless I learned to write songs myself, I was not going to have any good songs. I booked a songwriting session with Emma Hewitt, who's a vocalist, a good friend of mine, and I wrote a melody for a song, and I was like, "Here's the melody," and I sort of played it to her, and she said, "Do you have any ideas for lyrics?" And I was like, "Oh, no, I don't write lyrics." And she went away that night. We had another session booked the next day, and I wrote down some lyrics and I sent them to her. And because this story was so powerful to me, I had to write, listen, I know these are terrible. I know there's no way you're going to want to use any of these lyrics. I had to completely apologize and say, look, but maybe it may just provide some frame of reference that you can attach to. And she wrote back and said, these are really good. They're almost all the way there. Let's work on them tomorrow. And that was the first time I wrote lyrics.
Wow. So as you're sending these lyrics, you kind of have the remnants of this old story that you're not a good writer. And so you're kind of warning her ahead of time, the lyrics aren't any good, when actually, to your surprise, they were pretty good, and they were actually pretty close to the end product. That must have been
80% the end product. Yeah. I was basically setting up these defense mechanisms as we humans like to do. In that if she'd written back, yeah, you're right, these are rubbish, let me write something new, my ego would have been able to remain untouched. Whereas if I'd gone, I've written these lyrics, they're very personal to me, and then she didn't like them, that's a knock.
So you're kind of anticipating the possibility of a perceived rejection, and you're kind of preparing yourself for it so you don't feel it when you get this expected response that they're not very good. But then to your surprise, you actually were good. And then it's kind of gets you to, that's great, because then it starts to reinforce the new story. I am a big proponent of like reprogramming the mind. And a lot of times, one thing I want to say is that what I found is it's great to have new stories, but then also I found that you have to back them up with evidence. Like the mind is all that. Yeah. So you may say, oh, I don't believe this story anymore, that I'm not a good writer. But until you can give your mind some evidence, a proof that you actually can write lyrics, and the mind is kind of, like, it's kind of stuck in the past. So this was a good opportunity for you to reinforce the new story. The single that we were listening to on the way in, You'll Be Okay. I was reading about it, a Forbes article, reading about it in a Forbes article, and you said that you had written about, the song was about when you were on board a plane that nearly crashed years ago. And I have a quote here. You said, I genuinely thought that the plane was going down. I didn't have kids at that point, but I sent my wife a text basically saying, I think this plane is going down. If it does, just know I've had a full life, and it was my relationship with you that made it all worthwhile.
Yeah.
And basically that she'll be okay.
Yeah. And the song was sort of, came from that incident and another emergency landing experienced on board a plane, essentially taking the emotion from those two past incidents, but particularly You'll Be Okay is a song written off the basis of that one text message I sent my wife. And in the end, it became a more broader thing. It became something I could say to my kids. It became something that I think anybody could say to the people that are left behind when they're leaving this world. And people have interpreted the song many different ways. But yeah, the song came from that one message I sent to my wife when I was on a private jet and the cabin was like filling with smoke.
That anecdote, though, it really reminds me of when you see Love Actually. You know how in the beginning they talked about when the planes hit the towers, everyone was just calling and texting their loved ones, and it was all positive.
Yeah.
That's what that reminded me of. But I have just a very quick question, because You'll Be Okay is from the Lasers, right?
Yeah.
Is it called the Lasers because you were laser focused?
No.
Oh, man.
Although I was, for periods of producing the album, pretty laser focused. But no, the Lasers is really, when I decided I wanted the album to be like a band, I was like, if I had a band these days, what would I call it? And I'm sort of known for having pretty big, extravagant laser shows. And I was like, my band would be called the Lasers. That's what I would call the band. So I sort of named the album the name of the band. And you know, I may make a band out of the Lasers and have it be some spin-off to do sort of more band-like stuff. But yeah, that's where the name of the album came from.
Aw, I make dad jokes. That was a real sincere question, and I got a hard no. Dag nabbit.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you write these songs based off of past experiences. So rather than writing about what's going on right now in your life, you took various moments from the past and you wrote about them. Was that therapeutic for you, or what was the experience like with that?
It's extremely therapeutic. If I'd known how therapeutic it was, I would have been doing it longer. I probably would have saved myself some money from seeing therapists. But no, I think also I probably am in a better position to impart wisdom, if I can ever do that, with an incident that is somewhat in the rearview mirror. You know, often things are too emotional and too intense at the time they're happening, especially if it's an argument or like a breakup of some sort. And I've never been that good about writing things that are happening in that moment. Whereas once a little time has passed, I think you can write about it with a clearer head. You can probably give a more wise message for people reading it. And I also feel as well, I like thinking back to how a place looked and like and trying to remember like the visuals of it. And it's probably sometimes I'm writing about my recollection of it, which may not be exactly how it was, but I'm kind of fine with that.
It's interesting how the more time that goes by, because they say you look through the past through rose-colored glasses. And it's a mechanism of the brain to protect itself that the negative over time starts to fade away, and the more space that we have, we have more perspective on it. I love that idea of writing about something that you have had some space to kind of let life happen since then, and you could kind of look back and look at the big picture with each song.
Yes, if You'll Be Okay was written in the moment, it would be a much less philosophical. You know, the song is very much like, I've had a good life, I've done a lot of great things, sort of, you know, don't worry about it. Whereas if it was written in the moment, it would be more like, wow, I fucking hate planes. Why did I take this plane? Like, I'm never taking a small plane again. Like, it would be ruining the mistakes that led me to be on that plane at that moment in time.
Yeah, just looking at some of the lyrics here, you say, I know the light could fade from my eyes, my plane could fall from the sky. The world could tell me this is my time.
You never know when your time is.
But I love the hopefulness of the song, because after that you say, if I should die here tonight, darling, know that you saved my life. Aw. Yeah, usually I'm the one doing the ahs. Darling, you saved my life. I love that lyric.
Right. It's kind of, it's a bit of a twist, right? You have obviously your life has not been saved in that moment because you're dead. However, your life up to this point was saved by another person, and that is essentially, yeah, the crux of the song. And I don't still have that text message I sent. I don't remember how close these words were to what I actually wrote, but the sentiment was the same.
It's interesting when I look at the song. If this had played out, or say, so you've written this song for your wife, now you have kids, and then say you were to pass, and then the music lives on. It's almost as if you are giving them a story that they can take with them if you know, if they were on Earth longer than you are, it's like, this is a story that can kind of help them soothe themselves and to have peace knowing the impact that they've had on your life for the good.
Exactly. And for a long time, I would have been scared to write about this sort of stuff because I would have thought that and there's a lot of songs on the album about death. I don't know why I was hung up on it, but for a long time, I would have thought that by writing about death, you were...
Well, maybe because lasers kill people.
Not at a Gareth Emery show, though. We must.
All right.
Yes, you were saying, what was that last part that you were saying?
Yeah, like I probably for a long time wouldn't have written about death because I would have felt that by even shining a light on it, it would make it more likely to happen. I guess I realized in recent years that it's the one thing that's inevitable for all of us. So it certainly is going to happen to all of us at some point. So why not sort of stare down, you know, the barrel of the abyss and go, I'm going to live my life as much as possible, but whilst also not being afraid to talk about what will inevitably happen and leave behind something for sort of what comes after.
And there's almost a bit of a accepting what is and embracing it, that if this is, it's going to happen eventually. And kind of like the more you can embrace it and turn it into art, like you had said earlier, it becomes therapeutic. You're also creating something to leave for your loved ones. And it could be something that your fans can relate to and utilize in their life. Maybe if they had a loved one that passed or they're in a romantic relationship. It's very romantic, the whole idea of this song. That's why I wanted to feature it.
There's been a remarkable response to it from fans. And even before I ever even said what the song was about, because before I released the song, I played it in my sets for good 6 months as I was like testing it and fine tuning it. And one sort of big fan sent a really long message about her dog who died. And she basically had said, it was a super like sad message, but also very uplifting. And basically saying that, you know, the night before she had to take her dog to be put down, they played this song over and over again as she had the last night with her dog. And I was like, and this was an unreleased song. Like she'd had to like, you know, find like a bit in a YouTube YouTube video to play over and over again. And it just like, when I read that, I'm like, man, this is like touching people. And I sent her a kind of like nice piece of artwork of her dog because there were like photos on her Instagram. And since the song's come out, it's had a lot of people have taken it in a similar way.
Was that surprising to you? Or were you, I mean, anytime we put something out, we're hoping that people are going to relate to it. And I imagine, because you had mentioned earlier that this was the first time, or that you may not have written about this type of subject before.
Yeah.
Did you feel a little bit of nerves putting this out, not quite sure how it would be received because it was kind of a vulnerable thing for you? First of all, you wrote all the lyrics.
Yeah.
You're writing about something so personal. You're writing about a topic that is more serious, something that you've avoided in the past. And now you're putting this out into the world, and it's like the song belongs to the world now.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to sort of, you know, overly. Oh, sorry,
It just means you're popular. It's all good. Let's keep going.
No, I'm popular with scammers. Let's put this on airplane mode. I don't know why the scammers are coming to my computer. Either way, won't happen anymore. No, I think when it comes to putting the songs out, you never know if other people are going to see it the way you see it. And often they don't. I mean, that particular song, You'll Be Okay, I knew when I was making it, the song had a profound emotional impact on me. You know, when we wrote the song, I thought it was good. And then when Annabelle recorded the vocal for it, she just gave this wonderful emotion to it. You know, I felt, and like, I remember being in London after we recorded the song, every time I listened to it, I would be tearing up and having goosebumps. It was the song affected me a lot. And I remember telling myself, you've got to stop listening to this song because you're going to kill it before you've even produced the damn thing. So I knew it was powerful for me, but you can never second guess whether other people are going to experience the same emotions. And for me, my bit is making the art and putting out in the world. And generally, the stuff that is most powerful for me will usually also be the most powerful for the audience at large because, you know, they have similar tastes to me because they're, you know, supporters of my music, but not always. And you never quite know how it's going to go.
And how has your family received the music?
Well, my wife really enjoyed the song. And I'd never told her what the lyrics were about. And I'd never told her it was about that moment when I thought my plane was going down, and I texted her. And by the way, that incident would have been nowhere near as frightening for my wife as it was for me. I was a nervous, anxious flyer, and she's very relaxed and doesn't really have any form of anxiety or anything. So for her, she would have been like, oh, he's just freaking out. He's definitely fine. But she loved the song, and I'd given her an early version to keep on her phone. And then she was on a plane flying from Miami to Los Angeles, and she sent me a text of the chorus lyrics. If I should die here tonight, darling, no, you say. And I was like, what the fuck is happening? And I'm like, oh my God, are you okay? Is the plane going down? And she goes, yeah, I'm fine. She goes, I just like the song. I said, when you get home, I'm going to need to tell you what this song is about.
Oh, interesting. So she didn't know at that point.
No, she didn't know what the song was about.
Never know.
It's like she's on the ground.
You never know how someone's going to interpret a lyric at all. It can mean something completely different to a different person.
No, and and I'm totally fine with that. And I think in many ways, I have my interpretation, but I don't ram that down people's throats. Obviously, it's interesting to talk about, and I'm more than willing to share those stories. But I don't kind of go too heavily on what I wrote it about, because what I love about songs is the moment you release them, as you kind of said, they belong to the world rather than you. And I love people finding their own different versions of lyrics. And sometimes people they don't even know the right words, and they have their own story, which is based around a set of lyrics that are fundamentally incorrect. And I like that too. I think that's part of the beauty of it.
It's interesting being an artist, putting out music, writing about your life, and myself creating music, doing the radio show. Kind of a weird experience to be writing about people around you, putting it out there. And it's still something that I get, for instance, the very first episode of this show that we had done in season 1, we were talking about attachment theory and the way that your experience as a child with your caregivers affects your attachment styles. And so I was talking about aspects of my childhood that maybe weren't ideal, things that I had to deal with. And then my mom listened to the episode, and she's hearing me talk about my upbringing and my parents and what my experience was with them and how it affected me negatively. And she's like, I really, I love the show and I'm happy you're doing this. She's like, I was a little disappointed in that. And I told her that wasn't the only time I was going to talk about her, that there'd be, over time, more other aspects of our relationship would come through. But just in that moment, it was about specifically that topic. Yeah. So, it's a bit of a vulnerable thing. You're talking about personal issues or you're writing about them. And then you have people in your life interpreting the lyrics or hearing the music.
Yeah. And lyrics are a bit easier because they can be interpreted a multitude of different ways. I mean, I've also just written a book, sort of memoir about it's kind of, I took the sort of 9 or 10 stories that were behind the songs on the album and showed and told those stories in longer form, which kind of became a memoir. And my dad has to read it. He's not come in for a lot of blasting. My upbringing was pretty decent for the most part, but it is always a little bit awkward just telling these stories, because I kind of think that, people like us, we subscribe to being out in the public in some way when we take these jobs, that there's kind of a Faustian pact that we take. There's an upside and there's a downside. And I'm very comfortable with that, right? I have many, many upsides, and many, many downsides. I can pick my phone up in the morning and see somebody saying I fucking suck before I do anything else. But on the other hand, easier to get a table at a sold out restaurant. People like our family, they've not necessarily signed up for this. And I'm always a little sensitive about dragging sort of other people in my orbit into this stuff.
The thing about lyrics that is cool, that it's up for interpretation. You can be a little more, leave room for people to get what they would like out of it and to relate to it on their own terms.
Exactly. But, I've definitely dug into some stuff in the past that, it's going to make slightly uncomfortable reading. But then, I'm also a believer that for the most part, things happen for us rather than to us. And there were certainly childhood experiences that shaped my life that weren't entirely normal. But then, I also think there's nothing normal about wanting to be on a stage with thousands of people in front of you. Nobody wants to do that unless they're a little bit fucked up in some sort of way. Normal people want to work 9 to 5 and have a nice family and not have much stress. You need a almost psychotic level of commitment to become successful in any kind of artistic field. So, probably some of the pain I've had was necessary to get there.
I love this conversation where we're talking about the stories. We're talking about your album, the 4th studio album, The Lasers. We're going to continue this conversation when we get back after this short break. Welcome back to Life Rhythms Radio Show. I'm your host, Ryan Skyy. I've got special guests with me today, Gareth Emery. Hey, Gareth.
Hey, how you doing?
My manager and co-host, Scott Waldman. Hey, Scott.
Sing this song when I am gone.
So sing this song when I'm gone, lyric for Gareth's new song, single, You'll Be Okay, off of his fourth studio album, The Lasers, which we're featuring today. And topic-wise, we're talking about stories of the mind, the way that the stories that we have in our mind impact us. And something that's interesting to me is that a lot of stories in our mind, we kind of adopt from the people in our lives. We adopt from our society. Like as children, I notice you grow up and you kind of start out where you don't really know anything and people are telling you stories about who you are, about where you live, about the state of the world. And it's dependent upon the country you live in and the part of the country you live in and your economic background. There's all these stories. And then we're told stories about, into the future. If we go down path A, this is what's going to happen to you. And if you go down path B, that's what's going to happen to you. Something that I had to work through on myself was kind of navigating these stories and figuring out which ones were serving me and which ones were not. Because what I found is that suffering is 10% of it is our circumstance and 90% of it is the stories that we tell ourselves about the situation. So a lot of the times the situation itself is not actually creating the suffering. It's the story you're telling about it, the meaning you're giving to the situation. That's what actually a lot of times creates suffering. And Gareth, I'm curious, when you look back at your career and maybe even in the beginnings of the career, young Gareth, just starting out, what kinds of stories were you experiencing back then? The ones that were serving you and not serving you?
I think in the early days, there was a lot of negative stories that didn't serve me well. And even though I was having some level of career success, I definitely had it drilled into my head that I was lazy because as a child at school, I was told that a lot by my teachers. And I can be lazy at times. And I probably was in the early years of my career. And it took a lot of work to get past that one. And like you said earlier, proving that was not the case. But I had the story, as we said, that I couldn't write songs, that I couldn't write lyrics. And I think also, just when I didn't grow up being told music was a career. I live in Los Angeles now, but growing up in a suburb of England, nobody ever said to me, you can be a famous musician. It's just very, very hard and you'd have to work, obsessively for decades. It just was not on the radar of potential life outcomes. It was encouraged as a hobby, but that was as far as it went. The careers imagined for me by my family were the very best were doctors. They're absolute gods in the eyes of my family. And then sort of like lawyers and accountants, typical jobs like working for the man. And it took quite a lot of reprogramming to become comfortable with even being an artist and realizing that was a viable occupation.
How were you able to work through some of this pushback that you were receiving? So you had these stories that you were lazy, that music wasn't an option, and yet here we are today. You've got your fourth studio album out. So you were able to work through that and kind of reframe what you were telling yourself. Where did that come from? Are you into personal growth, or did you have a mentor or somebody that kind of lifted you up and maybe gave you the confidence you didn't have? Or did it come from experience?
Well, back then I was not into personal growth and I did not have any mentors. And to be honest, I wish I had, right? If I had discovered, I didn't discover any personal development stuff till about 5 years ago. And if it changed my life greatly. If I'd discovered Tony Robbins at the age of 17 or 18, it would have been, I would have skipped a lot of shit that I had to learn firsthand. But no, I had to get to the point of nearly losing it all. And I'd sort of given up my job and I got a record deal when I was 22 or 23. And 3 years later, I very nearly had to leave the industry. The hype had gone. Hype is very short. It's very fleeting. I've been unable to follow up my earlier sort of releases. And I was 26 years old. Most of my friends were in great normal jobs. I was like a full-time musician, but I was probably making, 10 grand a year. Lived in my parents' house, and everybody I spoke to was saying, you know what, like, you're a wicked DJ, but you've been trying this thing for like 3-4 years. It's not really working for you. Like, it probably is time to get a real job. And probably because music was never seen as a real career. That was also in my head. Like, I also believed myself that there'd be a limit to this, and one day I'd have to give in the dream and get a real job. And it's actually my dad, who's not really ever been much of a mentor, who said to me, he goes, you know what? He said, you're just lazy. He said, there's nothing wrong with your career choice. He goes, you're just lazy and you don't want it enough. And I took that really badly at the time, but it was what I needed to hear. And that was kind of the moment it began to turn around, I think.
That statement from your dad, there's hope in it, but then there's also criticism at the same time. It's like hope that you could do it and it is possible, but then a little bit of like a little nudge of move, get moving is in there.
And it was delivered in a critical way. I mean, because that's who he is. And I said, like, it was at a dinner, over the dinner table, and I remember screaming back, I work so hard. I'm in front of the computer for 16 hours a day. And he was like, doing what? He said, you're on MSN Messenger to your mates. He said, you're sitting on message boards. He said, you're messing around on the internet. He goes, you're not trying. He said, you haven't given it your best. And that was really true. And I kind of decided from that point, almost to sort of prove him wrong. I was like, you know what? I'm going to give this 6 months. And when it still isn't working, then I can say to him, there you go. I tried and it still didn't work. Fuck you. So, so I said, I'll give it 6 months. And I didn't have any gigs because nobody wanted to book me. So I had no professional engagements. And I started a podcast back in 2006. I was very early in the game to do that. And that was kind of the first green shoots. And I ended up doing that podcast for over 500 episodes in 10 years. And after 10, that it really turned things around. But that laziness thing was a hard one to rub out.
I love hearing that story because when I look at my own experience, the mind is always looking to confirm whatever the stories are present at the moment. And so it almost sounds like at the time, if you had a story that music is not really an option, it's probably not going to work out. It's all subconscious stuff. The subconscious mind is going to do things that are going to confirm those stories. So you kind of self-sabotage your own progress. And by doing these sort of self-sabotaging behaviors, your mind is confirming what your stories are. And it's this, I only realized this over the past maybe year or two, that the mind is not designed to make us happy. It's only designed to keep us safe and to confirm whatever is going on in there. So the mind is fine if you're suffering. The mind is fine if you're unhappy, as long as you're safe. If it thinks it's keeping you safe, if it thinks that, and a lot of times it will do that by looking for evidence to confirm whatever it is going on in the mind. But your dad threw a fork in there, and he was able to kind of like, you were able to start changing your story that it is possible. And I am going to prove my dad wrong. And my dad said, I can do it. I just need to take action, different actions.
Exactly. And it really started from there. And that led me on a journey of actually understanding what hard work was. And it really was a pivotal changing point in my life. I started my podcast. I started getting a few gigs again. I met a girlfriend who is now my wife that same year, 2006. And again, we talk about stories. So when my career first started, I made one record. It got me a really good deal. It got me into music full time. It got me out of my job. But that record was a little bit lucky, and I'd lucked out making it, and I was not able to follow it up. So for 4 years after making that song, I could not beat it. And for 4 years, every time I read what people were saying about me online, it was like, Mistral was a one-hit wonder. He'll never beat that track. And those stories managed to kind of get their way into my own head. And I believed I was a one-hit wonder. I'd lucked out. That was the best thing I was ever going to do, which I'd written in 2002. And that was the end. And when I finally did something, not even that beat that track, but that equaled it, just burying the ghost of that old track, man, that was good. And now I've beaten it many, many times over, 30 or 40 times over. But those are powerful stories that other people said about me, and I took them on and believed them.
In addition to calling them stories, we can also call them beliefs, like limiting beliefs, because the beliefs that we have, they lead to our thoughts, and then the thoughts trigger emotions, and the emotions trigger action, or in your case, in the beginning of your career, inaction. If you're But then as soon as we start changing our beliefs and our stories, then our thoughts change. And then the thoughts, again, they lead to emotions and lead to actions. And then you find yourself writing more hit songs, and you find yourself working harder and maybe getting up earlier and working longer days and kind of continuing to expand the possibility of what you could achieve.
Yeah, and it's even now I find it very, very difficult to believe the things that I still want to accomplish. And it's always been a challenge for me. I've always seen the next step as being very, very hard to get to until you do it. And then you can then repeat it and you can do it many, many times over. And, you know, I like visualization, like visualizing your goals and stuff, because that at least puts you a little bit in the right direction. And you're probably going to make some actions towards those goals. But even like when I think about things I haven't done yet, right? Like I want to turn the Lasers into a band. I want to play the main stage of the Glastonbury Festival and stuff. And these are still hard things for me to believe, despite the fact of coming so far to get to this point.
When these ideas come into your head, is there a tendency to kind of shoot them down right away? That they're not.
Yeah, I'll find any excuse for it. As we can always find. That's how my brain naturally works.
On a personal note, your upbringing with your parents, was there a critical? Was it kind of like a critical form of parenting? Because the reason I ask is something I've been learning as I've been studying the mind and the reprogramming stuff, is that the way we talk to ourselves in our heads tends to mimic the way our parents talk to us. So it tends to be the voice of our parents. Like we talk to ourselves in the same ways that our parents talk to us growing up.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Probably from my mother's side, not so much critical, but very high expectations, which didn't always align with what I wanted to do. So obviously, like I underperformed in them. So for instance, playing in bands was not something my parents were particularly interested in. They wanted me doing classical music recitals and stuff like that. So I kind of like went along with that stuff to be a good kid, despite the fact I didn't really enjoy it. And probably like failing in those things and not getting great marks on my classical piano music exams and stuff has probably had some long-term consequences, which is, and all we do with our own kids is we try and do a better job if we can. So like, for my kids, I don't really try and push them towards anything they're not super excited about. Kids are enthusiastic about enough different things. And I'm like, yeah, you don't want to draw? All right, let's go kick a football around the garden. You don't want to do that? Like, let's find what you're enthusiastic about and double down on that, because there's enough things out there.
How old are your kids?
3 and 5. So they're very much in the kind of trying loads of things, sort of exploratory, sort of part of life. So yeah, I try and pick the things that I wish were different about my own childhood and apply that a bit with my kids. But I also I'm sure I'm going to fuck up in some ways as well, because, we're humans and we just do the best we can.
Yeah, I don't have any kids, but there's no perfect way to raise anyone. And even when I look at my life and the experiences that I've had that could be considered, I've also find like we don't really know what's good and bad for us. No. Situations that happen that seem to be like the worst thing that could ever happen to you. And then years later, you look back and you're like, wow, that was the best thing that ever happened to me because of what the change the way it impacted my life and what it led to. And so me personally, I try to just accept things as they come and to try to not label them as good or bad for me, because I really don't know the impact of that.
I think there's also, when it comes to parenting, a pretty fundamental, like a philosophical question. I don't know the answer to this, but I have thought about it. I think we can kind of all we can all agree, if you have a parent that never sees their kids, they work 24/7, that's probably not particularly good parenting. However, I'm also not sure the parent that just lavishes their kids and keeps them super happy all the time and they never have any hardship is also the best parent, because those kids probably do grow up happy and well adjusted, but without a great willingness to do much in the world. And I think there is a certain sort of combination of attention, but also something giving you that drive to do something. I mean, you'll know, you've interviewed many, many people. Most people I know who grew up like super well adjusted adults did not have a great drive to go and do crazy things with their lives, did not want to go and be on stage or make art or invent the next fucking scientific discovery. Like most people who became super well adjusted were just pretty happy, like doing their thing. And I don't know, like, is that the target? It's hard to say.
It is hard to say. There's a duality to our world. I mentioned this in our last episode about duality of life and kind of like if you did have a difficult upbringing, the flip side is the positive effect it could have on your drive and your ambition and where that could lead you. And as you had said, if somebody is well adjusted, maybe they live a comfortable life, but maybe they're not pushing the boundaries and exploring and creating as much as they would if mom and dad weren't home all the time.
And I think, like, do we have, as human beings, are we supposed to be furthering the human race? And I think we probably are. Because when you play that situation out and say you just give up work, all you do is stay at home, you're the best parent, on paper, the best parent ever, and your kids grow up super well adjusted. They don't want to do crazy shit like play on stage at Glastonbury because they're well adjusted and they haven't got the neurosis and the chips on the shoulder that send people to the main stage of major festivals. So they grow up and they also become super well adjusted, and then they have kids and their kids do the same and they're super well adjusted. And that's great. You have this line of very happy human beings, but that are not likely doing anything to further our species in terms of the art we make or the things we discover. So, like, yes, you're all very happy, but why are you here? Now, on the other hand, I also think it's very sad when you get a great artist or a great scientist that are terribly unhappy. I hope there's a middle ground in there somewhere.
We need the well-adjusted and we need the struggling artists to create the music and push the boundaries.
Exactly. I think you never want to push somebody too far either way. So I try and, like, if my kids want to be well adjusted and not do much else, I'm totally fucking cool with that. But also if they do want to be artists, I hopefully can guide them in a way that they can do that whilst also maximizing their happiness along the way. Because, you know, trying to do great things does not necessarily lead to happiness. It's a hard road.
For our listeners that are thinking about maybe you had a difficult childhood yourself, I want to bring up this concept that I mention Eckhart Tolle in almost every episode. We were even talking the other day on the phone call, maybe trying to get him to sponsor the show because I mentioned him. I'm a huge Eckhart Tolle fan. He's an author, spiritual teacher, wrote The Power of Now. But he has this concept that I think is really interesting that I wanted to bring up on the show. And he has this concept of the little me. So if the big me would be kind of like, how we're all connected, the energy that flows through all of us, kind of the big picture, the consciousness or God, if you're religious, that's kind of like the big me. The little me is our own individual, like our ego, our individual story. And his concept of the little me is very interesting to me. It's like, we all have this little me, which is basically, it's just mental thought patterns and stories basically of who the mind thinks it is, like the identity that the mind has. And we have the little me basically has these stories of like where I came from, what my experience was growing up. And these stories, we can carry them for decades of like, oh, I grew up in a difficult household and poor me, this was my experience growing up and it was so difficult. And now like I'll never find love again. And I can't do this, I can't do that. And I'm lazy. And so we kind of like start forming an identity around this little me. His teaching is to kind of like move past the little me and to accept that just because we have thoughts and stories doesn't mean that that's reality. And when I was doing research for the show, I came across, it was really interesting to me, Deepak Chopra. I came across, he talks about how we have 60,000 thoughts, 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day. And of those thoughts, 80% are negative. And 95% of them tend to be the same thoughts, repetitive thoughts. And so it's interesting to me that if we have this story, we're constantly reaffirming it. And it's almost like when you buy a new car, you buy a blue Toyota, and then all of a sudden now you've seen the blue Toyota everywhere. The same thing happens with the stories we tell ourselves. If you have a story that you're lazy, the mind throughout the day is going to be looking for evidence to prove that you're lazy. And the only way to change that story is first you have to consciously decide to change the story. And then number two, you've got to give your mind evidence. That's something I want to bring up to our listeners. If they had a difficult upbringing and they have these stories going around in their mind, the first step is to try to kind of question, like, is that really reality? And then the next step is to then look for evidence to reinforce that story. And then over time, that story gets stronger and the other ones kind of atrophy away in your mind.
Yeah. And you need to make surprisingly few changes in order to see really positive results. You know, like we all know that one person who's just a victim, right? Everything is against them. They got broken up with their ex-girlfriend or whatever, and their life's been rubbish ever since. They're always unlucky. But then we also probably know that person who's like perpetual glass half full, who's always can see the positive, just automatically sunny disposition. And most of us are somewhere in the middle. But with a few of these techniques you mentioned, you only need to move yourself a few percentage points away from the victim type mentality and towards the glass half full person to start seeing some real changes in your life and happiness. It doesn't take that much.
You had mentioned that in the past few years is when you recently discovered personal growth. Are these the kinds of things that you're exploring, or what kind of teachings or is there, I'm curious, like what's been your process? I love talking about this stuff on the show.
I mean, meditation has probably been the one most important one for me, mainly because it's given me having some sort of, like meditation does not in itself solve problems. And I don't even always feel much better after I've done it, but training your mind makes you much better at spotting what is going on in your mind. So like after 3 or 4 years of good meditation, I'm just much more able to spot these negative stories when they start. And often just by seeing them and going, aha, you're slipping into that old pattern again, that sort of removes its power. The other one I really like, I don't do this often as I should, is just a visualization, just sitting and vividly imagining something you want to happen. And most of us do this unconsciously anyway. We decide we want a particular new car, we start thinking about it a lot. And that does have a way often of bringing that new car into our lives. And those two, I think, combined together remarkably, have been remarkably powerful for me.
When you do your visualization, are you sitting down and closing your eyes and dedicating a few minutes to playing scenarios out in your mind, or how does that work for you visually?
Yeah, I will use the Tony Robbins version of closing your eyes and vividly imagining something like you've already done it, which does seem to remove, because like once you've already done something, doing it again is much easier. At least it is for me. Vividly imagining something, you can almost trick your brain that you've done it. So then even though you're doing it for the first time, you sort of like, you've tricked some subconscious bit of your mind that you're actually just repeating it. And it's not always easy to do. It's not always easy to get myself to do it, but it certainly is powerful.
I love that idea of tricking the mind. I've read studies that they have shown that the mind cannot differentiate the difference between when you're visualizing something happening and it actually happening. The mind will respond in the same way to both situations. And so that's why the visualization, I love the idea of visualizing, because as you had said, it's much easier for the mind to repeat than to do something for the first time. And if you're visualizing it, the mind will automatically start to respond to the visuals as if it's actually happening.
Exactly. So for me, I have my at the moment, I'll be visualizing winning a Grammy Award. I haven't done that. I would like to. And being on the main stage of the Glastonbury Festival with the Lasers band. Now, these things, by the way, because my conscious mind goes, these are ridiculous. They're really hard things to do. You're never going to see them. And then I remind myself that I've already ticked off a lot of stuff I wanted to do via this exact method, but the new stuff always seems harder, which is why the visualization is important, because otherwise my conscious brain will just talk myself out of this stuff.
And that's the evidence playing out for you. That's you recognizing the mind kind of playing devil's advocate and saying you can't do it. And then you're countering it with evidence that you can do it. And you're reminding your mind, no, I've done this and I've done that and I did that. And this worked in all those situations. So therefore, it could likely work in this situation. It's like the evidence playing out. I love that.
Yeah, we automatically take for granted what we currently have, and I have to vividly remind myself. Like, I did not come from the suburbs of Southampton, England, making music in my bedroom at my parents' house, like in like a tiny little box room, to having a beautiful house in Los Angeles with a swimming pool and like an awesome career by accident. And it wasn't handed to me. Like, it was a process of visualizing things that I didn't think I could do and eventually doing them. And I have to remind myself of that, because otherwise you just take what you've already done for granted.
That's what I love about this show is I love to be able to have guests on like you and to hear your story of what you've done with your life. It really is extraordinary where you started and where you are now. And it's inspiring.
Thank you. Hopefully there's people, it does some good. These techniques do good for people listening.
Scott, I'm curious your thoughts on this.
I mean, I know nothing about meditation just because every time I've done it, I hated it. But I'm all for if people do it and they can center themselves and feel good. I find myself being exponentially more anxious during meditation.
And that can absolutely happen, right? And by the way, I'm not saying meditation is for everybody, because I'm not like a meditation, like I'm not in the business of selling meditation.
No, but it works for you.
Well, yeah, I often do find, though, like anxieties do come out during a meditation session. And that's pretty common, to find thoughts that are not particularly pleasant come out. And part of the power of it, at least for me, is staring down those thoughts. And I can't hide from them, because in meditation, there is nowhere to hide from your mind. You can't distract. I can't pick up my phone. I can't go and eat a bit of chocolate. You know, all the things you'd normally do to distract yourself and not available. So I have to sit there and stare down these horrible anxieties. But often, having confronted them in the meditation session sort of removes their power from my day-to-day life when they sort of rear their heads in other settings. If people are not anxious at all, and the only time it's ever happening is during meditation, that's probably not good. But I am prone to anxiety anyway, and being able to face those fears in like a meditation setting has kind of been helpful.
I've tried it a few times. I tried an app. I tried in person. It just didn't work for me. But like, I find there are just hours in the day where I'm more anxious than others, and circumstantially. And like you said, if someone's not anxious every time they're outside of meditation, that's another issue, because how can you not have anxiety issues at some point?
The thing of meditation, it's not supposed to remove anxiety. But what it will do is, and one of the techniques you learn is called noting. And all noting is when you see a thought, you note it. And so for me, experiencing a lot of anxiety in a meditation, every time my mind goes to an anxious place, I go, anxiety. And the moment you spot it and you shine a light on it, it immediately sort of loses its power. And in a meditation practice, you'll do that hundreds, thousands of times. You see something, you note it, done. But what that means is, I'm prone to anxiety in my normal life. Let's just say, for instance, my wife is gone to the shops and she's 30 minutes. She should have been home. She's not home. My anxious brain 5 years ago could go down a horrible kind of route of like, oh my God, she's been in a car crash. And like within like, a minute later,
you just go all these routes like, oh my God, this person isn't here. They were murdered.
Right. And I can go down rabbit holes very, very quickly. And within like a minute, I can suddenly, how am I going to tell her parents this horrible murder has happened or whatever? Like the brain can be very, very destructive. And what meditation has been helpful is now, the moment the rabbit hole begins, rather than sort of unconsciously going down it, I can kind of see it more often than not and go, anxiety.
There's a bit of a healthy detachment that happens when you start meditating and doing the noting. Once you're able to say, that's anxiety happening, you're kind of detaching from it and you're not identifying with the thoughts anymore. You're kind of able to step back and be like, okay, just because I'm having an anxious thought, A, doesn't mean this is whatever I'm thinking is actually going to happen. And B, if I'm able to look at the thought, then that also means that I am not the thought. Like if I have a remote control in my hand and I'm looking at the remote, I'm not the remote because I'm looking at the remote. So it's kind of like you're able to step back and have this little bit of a detachment. And as you had said, Gareth, that you're not like being dragged around all day by these unconscious thought patterns.
Yeah, I've actually never heard it said that way. And that's really interesting, by saying that just by the fact that you can observe it, it's clearly something separate to you. So you break this thing where like we are the thoughts. And I've not thought of it that way, but that absolutely is an effect as well.
Amazing. Well, we are coming to the end of the final segment. So we're going to wrap this up, but it was such a pleasure having you on today.
Really great chat. Super fun. You've made me want to go and meditate now, do my second one of the day.
The song, You'll Be Okay, that's what we've been featuring today by Gareth. It's on his 4th studio album, The Lasers. I encourage listeners, check it out. It's an awesome album. It's personal. Gareth wrote and produced it.
Thank you so much. I will say one very quick thing. I did have an amazing co-writer that helped me on a lot of these songs, Anthony Galasis. I just don't want him to see this interview and think I've kind of conspired to cut him out of the storyline. He's amazing and helped me a lot on the album. But I always feel like I want to give my people behind the scene a shout out when I get a chance. But there's been such an awesome interview and really, really inspirational stuff.
Well, thanks for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Ryan. Cheers.